Hello, in this episode of the House of Lechmere, I'm going to do what's called a reaction video. I'm going to react to a recent podcast that appeared on Richard Jones's Jack the Ripper Tour YouTube channel, which some of you might have seen. It was called Why Charles Lechmere Wasn't Jack the Ripper. Now, it's common in the historical world for people to disagree, discuss and dispute matters, and that's what I'm going to do here, to show that the arguments used against Charles Lechmere are, in my opinion, and I hope yours, not well presented or well founded. Of course, I don't expect everyone to agree that Charles Lechmere is the best suspect to be Jack the Ripper, but I do expect that sensible arguments are put forward rather than straw man arguments that only stand up when not put under any scrutiny. I'll go through this particular video as an exercise to illustrate some fairly typical arguments that are used to counter the Lechmere theory. After watching, you may still think that he's not a good suspect, but please watch to the end. This is also a very good opportunity to go back over some of the main aspects of the case, although, as you may notice, several very important issues are not addressed in this film at all. So I'm going to go through the video section by section and give my commentary.
We're going to look at a suspect, perhaps one of the most popular suspects in recent years, in that he generates lots of comments in the comment section.
Yes, undoubtedly, Charles Lechmere is good for business. It gets the viewers in. Ka-ching, one might say. So I don't really blame Richard Jones for doing a film on the Lechmere channel. He'll get lots of views. Very understandable.
And he's the man who, on August the 31st, 1888, round about 3:40 in the morning.
Okay, the first factoid that Richard comes out with, 3:40. This is illustrative of bias. There's not a great deal in this, but he plumps for the earliest time that the anti-Lechmere theorists prefer, 3:40, even though the coroner and the final police view, as illustrated by Donald Swanson in his report on the 19th of October, said it was 3:45. They don't like 3:45 because it creates too much of a gap for Lechmere being unaccounted for, which is why they go for 3:40. And this is kind of illustrative of a bit of bias that Richard's come out with 3:40 as opposed to the official final time, as I said by the coroner and the final police report time, which is 3:45.
He sees something in a gateway on the other side of the road. So he thinks it's a tarpaulin. He thinks it might prove useful because he's a carman, a delivery driver. He's out in all weathers, so it might make a useful cover for himself or for something in his wagon. So he starts to cross the road to...
Now, this is very disappointing of Richard Jones, and his first appalling, I'm going to say it's an appalling blunder. Lechmere most certainly didn't say he wanted to go across the road and scavenge this tarpaulin because it would be useful to put on his wagon or anything like that. He just said he looked across the road and saw what he thought was a tarpaulin. End of story. It's very unlikely even if that story was true, that he'd have wanted to go and scavenge this tarpaulin for his work. He wasn't self-employed, he worked for Pickford's. Pickford's had a big tarpaulin store at his depot at Broad Street. Didn't have to provide his own tarpaulins. But the fact that people, not just Richard, to be fair to him, run away with the story and start implying all these other motives about why he wanted to get the tarpaulin gives him an makes him innocent, because he innocently didn't know it was a body over there. He thought it was a tarpaulin. He thought he could use it for his cart and wrap himself up in all these other stories that people make up around it. And that's probably, in my opinion, why Lechmere said it in the first place, to create distance between himself and the body. He didn't know it was a person. He thought it was a tarpaulin. Why would he know it was a person? He didn't murder her after all. That's the sort of thinking there. But when you start giving these extra, inventing these extra elements to it, such as he wanted it for his wagon or something, you're kind of falling for it and you're not sticking to the historical truth.
But Paul comes walking up Bucks Row. Charles Cross then tries to get him to come over and look. At first, Paul is reluctant.
This reluctant There's nothing there to suggest he was reluctant to go and have a look at the body once he was told it. The element that he was reluctant is another, I'm afraid, another invention. I'd rather stick to the facts of the case.
Because it's often stated in the comments section on this channel that he's the likeliest of all the suspects, Charles Lechmere. He's the most credible suspect because he is the only suspect to be found at the scene of a Ripper murder shortly after the murder had taken place. So, of course, this opens two questions. Firstly, and I'll ask the two questions separately. Firstly, why is he a suspect? He found the body.
This is kind of bad form. Richard's using the comments section on his videos, people who make comments, average people who make comments on his videos, as the basis of his arguing against the Lechmere theory. He should really be quoting from the stated opinions of the main proponents of the Lechmere theory rather than from enthusiastic posters, as there are many complex details and nuances associated with the Lechmere theory. It's not fair to base a critique on what a good-willed but inevitably less well-informed, although perfectly decent enthusiast might post in the comments section on his YouTube channel. When I critique other theories, I only use the main sources, and it's intellectually dishonest and slightly shameful to dig out people who make comments on his video channel. I'll give you an example, bear with me on this. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, there was a huge and sometimes bitter and acrimonious dispute between Geoffrey Elton, a professor of history at Clare College, Cambridge, and Professor John Scarisbrick of the University of Warwick, a less prestigious institution, over the Henrician Reformation, that is, the break with Rome in the age of Henry VIII. Such historical disputes are very common and healthy, but if I was to offer a critique of Professor Scarisbrick's thesis, I would base it on what Professor Scarisbrick said. I wouldn't base it on an interpretation of it that might be found in an essay by an enthusiastic A-level student. That, unfortunately, is the equivalent of what Richard Jones is indulging in here, and throughout this film, he uses the enthusiastic posters on his YouTube channel rather than going to the proper sources, the acknowledged experts on the Lechmere theory. But going back to the meat of this, Charles Lechmere is unique of the finders because he was seen or found by someone else, noticed by someone else, at the crime scene before he'd raised the alarm. All the other people who found the bodies went off and raised the alarm. Because Lechmere was found by someone else there, we can't say for sure what his action would have been had Paul not turned up. That is a fundamental difference. And the posters, they were good posters in actual fact, the people who posted on his film, they know the theory actually. They said he was found by someone. He was found. Not that he found the body. He was found by someone else. And Richard Jones did a little switch. Oh, he found the body. That isn't it. That's never been it.
No, it does. It baffles me because somebody's got to find a body. And then we're basically saying, well, is it the fact that Robert Paul existed? Because if Robert Paul didn't exist, it'd be exactly the same as all the other first finders. It's Robert Paul who did the finding. He found, and I don't like using the word found, he found Cross in Bucks Row. To me, he noticed him. He saw him in Bucks Row. You know, I think found is particularly the wrong word to be used there.
Because it suggests suspicion.
It does. It does. It adds bias where, if we're being fair, and I try to be fair, there shouldn't be.
Yes, Richard Jones discusses this case with another guy. I can't remember what his name is, to be fair. Indeed, someone had to find the body, but that isn't it. And it's true to say that Robert Paul, as I just said before, is responsible for this strange situation with Lechmere. We don't know how Lechmere would have behaved had Paul not been there. That is the point. And we know how the other suspects behaved. They behaved legitimately. They behaved as you'd want them to behave. They raised the alarm. They came back to the body with whoever they raised the alarm with. There was no mystery. There's no other person, such as PC Neal, to find the body later, and for the case to be misinterpreted for the first few days, the first 3 days, because it was thought that PC Neal had found the body and not Lechmere. There was none of this mistake in the other cases. There was uniquely in this case. So it isn't the same as the other finders. It just isn't. And that is why it's a red flag. It invites further investigation. Anon said there is this phobia about using the word found. The words don't matter. It's the scenario. Lechmere's there near the body. Paul comes up, he sees, he discovers, he finds, he notices. Doesn't matter what word you use. You may get the heebie-jeebies over the word found. Doesn't matter what word you use. It's the scenario.
Using that logic or using that argument, you could argue that people, Louis Diemschutz or John Davis, you could argue that any of those who found the body could have been responsible.
Is there a comparison with the other first finders? Saying that shows a very basic lack of understanding, because none of those other first finders, such as Louis Diemschutz or any of the others, was seen by anyone else by the body. That's the fundamental, which is not seemingly not got. And we know their actions afterwards. We know how they behaved by going and raising the alarm in a normal way. We don't know how Lechmere, as I'll say again, we don't know how Lechmere would have behaved had not Robert Paul been there. And even with Robert Paul being there, there was a great big mix-up anyway, and it was a very strange scenario anyway. So that is the difference. That is why there's no comparison with the other finders. It's not because Lechmere found the body, it's because Robert Paul found, noticed, saw Lechmere by the body.
But who decides who was a suspect? That's that, and what criteria is used?
The simple answer is anyone can decide who's a suspect. Anyone can propose a suspect. There's no law on it. It's a democracy. It's a rough form of democracy. In the arena of public opinion, some will gain traction, some won't gain traction. It's a bit like trial by jury. And a trial by jury is a form of democratic law giving, and so the simple answer is anyone can propose a suspect. Some are popular, some are unpopular. That's just the way it is.
Do you think the police would have had any suspicions of him at the time? Do you think he, obviously, we've lost so many records. We don't know people they interviewed. We don't know, in fact, we don't even have the inquest testimonies. So do you think he was looked at the time as a possible perpetrator?
I would have thought so, yes. I know Abilene said that extensive inquiries had been made, and I would suspect everybody who had found a body or been involved in finding a body would have been questioned at some point, especially when a week or so later there's a body found on the only route we know he took to work on any particular morning.
With Lechmere, we know pretty categorically that he was never under any suspicion or ever closely interrogated or questioned, and this is never admitted by the people who don't favour the Lechmere theory. They never discovered his name was Lechmere. If they did discover his name was Lechmere, he'd have had to have mentioned it in court, and as late as the 19th of October, Donald Swanson's still just referring to him as Cross. In police reports, if they knew alternative names, they recorded them. They did not discover his true name was Lechmere. If they never discovered that, it shows that they didn't investigate him to any appreciable degree. Even Walter Dew, who was became a famous policeman at the time of the Jack the Ripper inquiry. He was quite a new constable, and in his memoirs that he wrote obviously many years later, again he just refers to him as Cross. They just didn't know. They were oblivious to his name being Lechmere. and that tells its own story. The fact that Aberline said that they investigated everyone and checked everybody means nothing, actually. During the Polly Nichols inquiry, the police said they'd checked everyone, and then the coroner asked them and found out they hadn't. They say they've checked everyone when they don't. And in serial killing cases this day, the same thing happens. And we've got a long list of people, particularly around the time of the Polly Nichols murder, of the people they did check. The slaughterhouseman round the corner, Robert Paul himself. There's a long, long list. And guess what? Lechmere's name doesn't appear in it. The strange thing is that we know that some modern suspects, such as George Hutchinson, or Joseph Barnett, who was the boyfriend of Mary Kelly, were interrogated and cleared effectively, but they are still suspects. So, it doesn't actually stop people promoting suspects. But the reality is, there's no way the police did investigate Lechmere. It's almost an impossibility, as I said, because they just didn't discover his name. It's quite amusing that this bloke found the Hanbury Street thing a bit suspicious and would have heightened suspicion. I'll come on to that a bit later on.
Because it's often said in the comment section that he was found lingering suspiciously at the scene of the crime. Now, I've read so many of the reports, newspaper reports, etc., and none of them actually talk about him lingering.
This infatuation with lingering, there's a whole section in this film about lingering, is a typical example of picking up on a stray remark made by a poster. I've never really heard of this suggestion that he lingered before. They've latched upon this stray remark and made a big deal of it. But actually, when you do read the accounts, when Robert Paul, saw Lechmere in front of him, Lechmere, by his own account, waited a little while before he walked towards Paul. So in fact, Lechmere did linger a bit, and it's in the records. He said so.
If we look at it from Charles Cross's testimony, he said in some reports that when he got to the corner of the Wool Warehouse, he noticed a bundle on the other side of the road. Now, in the book, I've drawn a chart which states that particular point is 61 feet away from where poor Polly was lying. So if he crossed to the middle of the road from that point on the diagonal, which most of us would because it's the most direct route, then he would have been 30 feet away from, or 30 and a half feet away from the body, which is 10 yards. That's a considerable distance.
This theory has been raised before, that he walked diagonally across the road from a considerable distance away, that he saw Polly's body, tarpaulin, a considerable distance away. 60 feet is 20 yards in the pitch black. He saw this thing laying down in the road in front of him, low down in the dark, actually within the dropped curb of the gateway into Brown Stable Yard. He still saw it in the dark and walked diagonally across the road. The reason it's proposed is they want to sight Lechmere as far away from the road as possible. If he walked up the side of the road and looked across and noticed Polly Nichols' body laying over there and then walked across that way, by the time he got to the middle of the road, he'd be very close to the body. They don't want him to be very close to the body, so they concoct this elaborate story that he saw the body from an angle and walked obliquely across the road. It's based on basically one stray newspaper report. But the reality is, if he was walking up the road in the dark, it would have been impossible for him to see at 20 yards a form laying that low. And if he did, it would mean it was actually quite light, and they should have been able to see the blood. So which way do you want it? To show you what it's like as an experiment, I walked around a bit in the dark to see what it was like and how much you could see or not see. And basically I took out a tarpaulin, it was just impossible to see at any distance at all, and that's in lighting conditions a lot more favourable than it would have been at Bucks Row. If you go into the light and out of the light, you just can't see a thing. You can't see a thing. It's particularly something lying low, stationary on the floor, and she would have been wearing darkish clothes as well. So it's a total nonsense that anyone would have seen her at 20 yards away, which is 61 feet. There were numerous reporters at the inquest, and there's only one really stray report that says about the wool warehouse. They clearly got mixed up because the wool warehouse was on the side that he was walking down, and there was another gate opposite, and the reporters, who were writing down in shorthand and unfamiliar with the exact layout of the street, clearly got mixed up and said it was the gate of the warehouse when it wasn't. And it just makes no sense on the ground either. But they want it to be that way because they want him to be as far away as possible. And this is the way nearly all the press reports covered Lechmere's testimony of seeing what turned out to be Polly Nichols on the other side of the road. Passing through Bucks Row, he saw on the opposite side something lying against a gateway. That's the opposite side, not somewhere some distance ahead. And to show how muddled up some of these reporters were, there was another reference to the wool warehouse in the Evening Standard. As I got up to Bucks Row, I saw something lying on the north side in the gateway to a wool warehouse. It was actually on the south side. The north side was where the wool warehouse was, but the gateway where it was on the south side. So it's clear that the reference to the wool warehouse and the gateway and they got mixed up when they were writing it down. It must also be remembered that Robert Paul, in his first account of what happened, said he saw the person, who was Lechmere or Cross, where the woman was. If he was 10 yards away and then came back a little bit as well, because that's what he's supposed to do, he's supposed to come back a little bit towards Robert Paul, then he wouldn't have described him that way, would he? This is what Robert Paul actually said. It was dark and I was hurrying along when I saw a man standing where the woman was. And there's another account where they meet. He goes towards Paul a bit, they meet, and they walk opposite the body. If he had to walk a long way, further up the road to get to the body, he wouldn't have described it that way, would he? It's utter nonsense. He discerned on the opposite side something lying against the gateway, but he could not at once make out what it was. When he came up, witness said to him, "Come and look over here. There is a woman laying on the pavement." They both crossed over to the body. So they make it clear, they come up and cross. They don't walk obliquely a long way across the road.
When he was in the middle of the road and noticed it was a body, he heard footsteps from about 40 yards away.
This is another one of these aspects where they're very choosy about what information they give you. There was another report that said there was 30 or 40 yards away, but they only say 40 yards. They forget the 30 or part of it because that's inconvenient to how they want to sell the story.
But remember, we've got Robert Paul. Robert Paul never actually says at what distance he saw him. He never said if he saw him when he was coming into Bucks Row. He never said if he saw him when he was halfway up Bucks Row. He just said he saw him in the middle of the road. Robert Paul never mentions how far away Cross was when he first.
Robert Paul says he saw him in front of him, standing where the woman was in the middle of the road. That's the first time he mentions seeing him. If he'd seen him at the corner of Bucks Row and had been walking behind him all the way up, don't you think he might have mentioned it? This is just another example of them inventing information. We have it in black and white when Paul saw him. He saw him when Lechmere was stationary in the middle of the road where the woman was, not halfway up the road walking in front of him. Paul makes it explicit.
I often think to myself, well, when I'm walking early morning or late evening down the street, how really aware am I of my timings?
Well, Richard, walking obliviously down the street, not aware of his timings, has got no real is not a basis of comparison to Robert Paul saying he was late for work and rushing to work. He was clearly was aware of the time, because he knew he was late for work and he knew he had to be at work at a certain time. He had to be aware of the time. The same with Lechmere, who had supposedly only just left home and again claimed to be late for work. So they should have known the time. It makes sense that they did know the time. They had to be in work on a certain time, and they'd only just got up, they'd only just left home. So it makes no sense to say they weren't aware and they were just wandering around in a trance.
Charles Cross wasn't actually late for work when he left home. I think Robert Paul was. Charles Cross, I believe, said he was only behind time because of the involvement with finding Polly Nichols and talking to Misen. I don't think he was actually late leaving home.
Lechmere gave no indication whatsoever as to why he was late. He just said he was late for work. All the reports pretty much said, the coroner. Did the other man tell you who he was? The witness, that's Lechmere. No, sir. He merely said that he would have fetched a policeman, but he was behind time. I was behind time myself. So there's no indication there that Lechmere was on time when he left home, or the reason why he was late for work. He doesn't supply that. He just said he was behind time. So another falsehood.
And a big red flag for those who put him forward as a suspect is that he gave a false name to the police and gave a false name to the inquest. And in fact, his name was Charles Lechmere. So the fact that he gave a false name to both the police and at the inquest means that he must have had something to hide. Vis-a-vis, he must have been the person who had murdered Mary Nichols.
In fact, he gave his legal name at the inquest that morning. The law states your legal name is the name you wish to be known by. And he gave the name Charles Alan Cross, so he wished to be known as Charles Alan Cross. So Charles Alan Cross is his legal name.
You can't have two legal names. In 1888 alone, he showed on several occasions what he wished to be known as. On the birth of his daughter, on the baptism of his daughter, when he registered his children at school as the parent, when they changed schools, because he changed addresses in June of 1888, and when he went on the electoral register for his new address in 1888 as well. And that means his rent and rates at the same time were in the name of Charles Lechmere. He had chosen his name legally to be Charles Lechmere. When you turn up in court and just come up with a random name, doesn't change what your legal name is. He'd shown that he wished to be known as Charles Lechmere in all these other instances, before and after the appearance in the inquest. In English law, there's nothing to stop someone calling themselves anything they want in any given occasion. But this isn't the point. He chose to withhold that legal name that he used in all these other instances throughout his adult life. He chose to withhold Lechmere. He chose to only call himself Cross. You kind of say, oh, he just felt like it. These things have reasons behind them. And there is, of course, the Kosminski dog walking case, when the police and the court insisted on Kosminski, who went under the name of Abrahams in that case, of fessing up and telling them his real name. So the police and the courts were very interested in real names.
And he also gave his home address and his work address. So I'm not really quite sure how that is the work of a criminal mastermind, if he was trying to hide his identity. Or
I'm not sure why he thinks that he should be a criminal mastermind, and who suggested he should be a criminal mastermind. Most serial killers aren't criminal masterminds, believe it or not, but they tend to give false names reflexively. It's a reflex action. It's not something where they think the long-term consequences of it. It's exactly what Peter Sutcliffe did, the Yorkshire Ripper, when he was arrested, that led to his conviction. He reflexively gave a family name instead of his real name. Didn't do him any good, did it? Christie, the murderer from 10 Rillington Place, when he went on the run in London after he moved out, and the bodies were found and everyone was after him. And when he was stopped by a policeman, again, he gave a name that is associated with his dead wife. Reflexively, didn't stop him from being arrested and hung, and found out very quickly afterwards who he really was. They do it instinctively. They just say it instinctively instead of saying their real name. Doesn't mean that they're going to get a great big advantage out of it. It's just what happens.
So if the police needed to question him again and they had a little ride out to Doveton Street and knocked on the door and said, "Are you Charles Cross?" And he went, "No, I'm Charles Lechmere," I think they would have gone, "Well, you look like the Charles Cross we need to speak to."
This is a bit of an irrelevance, isn't it? They clearly didn't go round there, and if they did and found out that he was someone different, I think they would have been a little bit interested.
Numerous times, too many to count. Again, I've asked how and why. How and why was given Charles Alan Cross amount of subterfuge? How did giving Charles Alan Cross make him the serial killer and give him an advantage as a serial killer? And nobody can answer that. Nobody ever has, that I'm aware, has answered that question.
Well, if you dig a very little bit deeply, you'll find that this question has been answered on numerous occasions. For a start, as I just said, they do it instinctively. People like that, when they're caught, they just say the first name that often comes into their head, which tends often to be a family name, is something easy to remember. That's what they do. It doesn't mean they're a criminal mastermind, they're going to get away, or it doesn't mean that actually it benefits them necessarily in any way. The long list of ones, including Dick Turpin, who gave a family name. Didn't do him any good, he got executed. Doesn't necessarily do them any good, they just do it. It doesn't take that much imagination to think why he may conceivably have not wanted to bring the name Lechmere into it. If, for example, he was known for being a local brute or someone who'd misused the local unfortunates. We don't know that. It's not the sort of thing that would necessarily get into police records or to magistrate court records. And so there's lots of potential reasons why he may not have wanted to have the name Lechmere drawn into public scrutiny, quite besides from the point that serial killers and criminals of this type often just reflexively come up with a false name as a sort of like a security blanket that often does them no good whatsoever.
He uses the name Charles Cross, but he did have a legitimate cause to use the name Charles Cross because his stepfather was named Cross.
Yeah, and on the census in 1861, he was named Charles Cross, and his sister was named Emily Cross, but that never seems to get mentioned.
Well, actually, it was no more legitimate for him to call himself Cross than Smith or Jones or any other name. He had no legitimate reason to call himself Cross, just because his stepfather, who was 19 years dead by then, had been called Cross. His sister was indeed listed in the 1861 census as Cross, as he was. But in that census, Thomas Cross, the stepfather, falsified his age by 10 years, added 10 years to his age, so he could have been biologically the father of Charles Cross and his sister, because he was otherwise too young. So the 1861 census was effectively, the census entry for this family was essentially a falsified document anyway. Now, his sister, when she died a few years later, which he doesn't mention, and I have mentioned his sister in several films before, his sister, when she died a few years later, died as Emily Lechmere, not as Emily Cross, and that was before Thomas Cross died. So that tells its own story about the use of the name Cross within that family.
And if we look at the 1876 road traffic accident involving a Charles Cross, we can probably assume that was our man, because there was no census information that tells us there was another carman in the area called Charles Cross apart from the one who we know.
Well, actually, he says not in the area. He thinks the River Thames is some sort of a barrier to people crossing. There were 2 Charles Crosses who are carmen south of the river, which was in the area because these people travelled about doing their job. And there was actually a younger guy called Charles Cross who lived very close to this particular accident, who may have been too young at the time of the accident to have been an independent or a driving carman. We don't know.
The only times we know he spoke his name, he's given the name Charles Alan Cross, and under oath to boot.
Yeah, that's the only times we know he called himself Charles Cross is in 2 inquests where he was involved in one way or the other in the death of people. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement, is it?
But some of them are his children's school records, so they're his kids' names, they're not his. And there are also a lot of electoral rolls in that 100, which really should be just counted as one because it's the same thing. You know yourself. I've just had one through the door this week for the electoral roll. You just tick a box.
Well, back in those days, you didn't just tick boxes to go on the electoral roll. That's not how it used to be done, unfortunately for this guy. Now, the school records, when he sent his children to school, he was their parent. He was down as their parent. So the school records of his children going to school are very relevant. The electoral roll is also relevant because he changed address multiple times. He doesn't miss a single entry despite moving addresses quite a few times in his adult life. He's always on the electoral roll. And you are on there because you paid your rates. And again, it wasn't an automatic thing. If you didn't pay your rates, you were chucked off the electoral roll. So it was constantly being checked through your rate paying and your rent paying, because they were kind of connected to each other. And so his name appearing on the electoral roll all that time, in every time he moved address, is very significant. This was in respect of claiming that he didn't really call himself Charles Lechmere in his normal life, and it didn't really amount to much, by the way.
Another red flag against him is that he was very arrogant, that he had a trait of arrogance, so much so that he even had the audacity to turn up at the inquest into Mary Nichols' death wearing his work clothes. And these work clothes were very dirty work clothes. They were very grubby work clothes, so much so that one newspaper, I believe it was the East London Observer, felt compelled to actually comment on the state of his dress when he turned up at the inquest. So what do you make of that? Obviously, turning up in your old clothes at an inquest or in your work clothes, it doesn't show any respect to the court.
That, and as well as something else we might talk about, is the case here. The simplest explanation was he went to work, he went to the inquest, he went back to work. Hence, he had his work clothes on. And to this day, I've asked numerous times how wearing an apron at an inquest is a sign of guilt, and it's never been answered. But that's the point. It's not the fact he wore an apron, it is why is wearing an apron a sign of guilt, especially when there's evidence of other witnesses wearing shabby clothes as well at other inquests. It seems to have been commonplace.
There's a terrible confusion between these two here over shabby clothes and aprons. The East London Observer doesn't mention at all that he was wearing dirty or shabby clothes. It just says he's wearing an apron. And that's the thing that was picked up on as part of the Lechmere theory. But what isn't part of the Lechmere theory is this claim of arrogance. I don't know where that was dreamt up. No one, as far as I'm aware, has ever said that he turned up in court showing arrogance by being in a scruffy clothes, arrogantly turning up in scruffy clothes and being perhaps disrespectful to the court. I've never heard that suggested. So this is, I'm afraid, another example of them arguing over something or arguing against something which doesn't exist. The significance of the apron has been discussed on numerous occasions. Why anyone would think that it hasn't is again beyond me, unless they haven't really looked into the Lechmere theory, which is becoming very blatantly obvious. That's what lies at the heart of this film. People who haven't really looked at the Lechmere theory properly and who aren't qualified to speak about it. An apron is something you can easily take on or off. Carmen's aprons, as we can see in photographs of Carmen's, tended to be quite big things, quite unwieldy, difficult to walk around in. Perhaps they were designed to keep you clean and tidy on a horse, not for walking down the street, or not for appearing in the dock or the witness stand at an inquest in. It was something you could easily take off before you appeared in the witness stand. And most people, I'm sure, would. Why would you go around in a great big heavy apron into the witness stand? You could just take it off and leave it on the seat, couldn't you? No one's going to nick your dirty old apron. So, as per the Lechmere theory, why does he wear his apron in court? To reinforce the fact that he was a humble carman, to reinforce in the eyes of the coroner and the jury that he was a humble carman in his humble apron, part of the woodwork. Carmen were part of the woodwork, travelling up and down, delivering goods around the place. Inconspicuous, this nobody, humble carman. The opposite of being arrogant, in fact. He was conveying the exact opposite, as shown by his inquest testimony, whereas yes sirring and no sirring the coroner as well. So it's the exact opposite of that. It's to, in my opinion, to reinforce his humble, I'm a nobody characteristics, which he wanted to promote.
At the end of the day, Charles Lechmere was never tried in court. He's an innocent man. And I think if we keep pushing for his guilt where there isn't any, we sort of disrespect him. And we also disrespect the victims, because we're trying to pin a crime on somebody that maybe didn't commit.
Well, I think that the other thing about him is that he's the absolute reverse of what the burden of proof should be. And of course, the whole principle of a trial, a criminal trial, is or even a criminal investigation, is you're innocent until proven guilty. But those who for Lechmere seem to be, well, we think he's guilty. You prove that he's not guilty.
It's very interesting that people argue against Lechmere as a suspect. It's only with Lechmere that it said, oh, you can't bring this person up as a suspect. It's disrespectful to the victims, or it's disrespectful to him or his memory or something like that. Why isn't that case made about all the other suspects, hundreds of other suspects? Why is that case never made about any of the other suspects? I don't mind being held to a higher level of scrutiny, because he's the best suspect in my opinion. He deserves to be held to a higher level of scrutiny. He deserves for people to say, oh, how could you take him to court and not judge him as innocent until proven guilty? Do you ever say that about other suspects? Is that ever made the case? Whenever anyone makes a case against another suspect, oh, you should only, in a court law, you should be innocent until proven guilty. Well, I think Lechmere is the only one who could go to court, even in a recreated trial now. It would be interesting to do, but and so I don't mind being held to a higher level of evidence than all the other suspects, and held to a higher level of scrutiny, which is what they're actually doing there. It's a backhanded compliment, of course.
Let's look at another major strike against him then, and this is the strike that's brought up about the wounds on Mary Nichols's body. And it's often said in the comment section, the wounds on Mary Nichols's abdomen were covered, whereas they weren't with the other victims. It is argued that Charles deliberately hid the wounds so that Robert Paul wouldn't notice them, and so wouldn't realise that a murder had been committed. Were the wounds really deliberately covered or hidden?
I'm not sure they were actually hidden at all, because we get PC Misen saying the clothes were disarranged. We get Robert Paul saying our skirts were up to our stomach, where your stomach is just below your rib cage. Now, he might not have known that by saying stomach. He might have thought stomach is more or less where your intestines are, a bit lower down. But if we take his words as being strictly correct, your stomach is below your rib cage. So if the skirts were up to your rib cage, just below the rib cage, there would have been unsure.
What did Paul actually say? He said her clothes were raised almost up to her stomach. Almost. He forgot that word almost, didn't he? Robert Paul was also recorded as saying the clothes were disarranged and he helped to pull them down. It was Paul that said that, not Misen. What did Lechmere say about it? The woman's legs were uncovered. Just her legs were uncovered, nothing about her abdomen being uncovered where the wounds were. There's also this by Lechmere. When I found her, her clothes were above her knees. There did not seem to be much clothing. The other man pulled her clothes down before he left. So according to Lechmere, it was just her legs that were uncovered. And when you think about it, Paul pulled her clothes down. If her abdominal wounds had been left on display, left on show, and weren't covered, then as he pulled them down, he'd have been pulling her clothes down with his hands over her wounds of her stomach. And what would that, he'd have got blood on him, wouldn't he? Fairly obviously. So common sense tells us that she was covered, and their testimony of both Paul and Lechmere tells us that the wounds were covered.
However, there are people who suggest the abdominal wounds at that particular point hadn't even happened. They thought Jack was hiding behind the corner somewhere, and once Cross and Paul had gone to find mice, and he sneaked back in and finished the job.
Why would anyone say this who knows anything about the topography of Bucks Row? Bucks Row was a straight, clear road, nowhere to hide. There was no hiding place down Bucks Row. If he went past Bucks Row into the area in front of the board school, again, he'd have had to go round the corner of that into Winthrop Street, where there was a night watchman, Mulshaw, who said he was awake at that time. There was no other hiding place. The only person who would come out with this sort of remark is someone who's never been to the area, who doesn't know anything about the lay of the land at Bucks Row. It's a ludicrous remark.
If they were covered, why did Charles Cross cover the wounds and then go and stop a passerby to show him what he'd done? That doesn't make any sense to me. Why would he cover up his handiwork and then go and stop the first passerby and say, hey, come and have a look at my handiwork? That surely doesn't make any sense.
Who would suggest that a serial killer would go up to some stranger approaching in the street to show them their handiwork? That's not what's suggested at all. It's almost, it defies reason, this. He would have gone up to Paul because he'd been interrupted. He felt he had to go up and confront the situation rather than flee and bluff his way out. He wasn't showing them his handiwork. He was showing them, look, there's this body, I haven't really seen it properly yet. I was only here just before you, and let's go and have a look at it together. Oh, what have we found here? That's what it was about, not showing them his handiwork. And clearly he hid the wounds so he wouldn't have to show them his handiwork, so they weren't on display, so it wasn't so obvious that she'd been killed. That was why he did it.
Sort of suggestion that the abdominal wounds came first, because the coroner mentions that, or questions that. Charles Cross heard Robert Paul from 40 yards away. So in that time, he would have had to pull the clothes down to cover the wounds, cut poor Polly's throat twice, wipe his knife, wipe his hands, put the knife and the rag about his body, about his person, get back to the middle of the road, plot out his bluff, and appear all calm and collected.
It wasn't the coroner who suggested the abdominal wounds came first. It was Dr. Llewellyn who suggested it, and the coroner picked up on it. In his summing up, the coroner said, Dr. Llewellyn seems to incline to the opinion that the abdominal injuries were first and caused instantaneous death. Now, whether the abdominal wounds came first or second isn't exactly a very important part of the Lechmere theory. It's not really very important at all as far as the Lechmere theory is concerned. But it was Dr. Llewellyn's opinion, and so has to be taken cognizance of. And so it could have happened that way, in my opinion. But how long would it actually take for the killer, whether it was Lechmere or anyone else, if they'd done the abdominal wounds first, to cut the throat and clean the knife? A few tens of seconds. According to Dr. Llewellyn, the whole murder, which would comprise strangling her first, laying her down, lifting the dress, performing the abdominal wounds, leaving the dress to fall, cutting the throat, wiping the knife, and then doing it. That whole business, according to Dr. Llewellyn, the murder might have occupied 4 or 5 minutes. With Lechmere saying that he heard Robert Paul at 30 or 40 yards away, that's when he would have retrieved his position in the middle of the road. What would have happened is Lechmere would have dropped the skirt, slashed the throat quickly, wiped the knife on the dress, stuffed it in his apron, retreated 2 steps into the middle of the road. How long would that take? Seconds, really. And then Paul is 30, perhaps 40 yards away. When he first noticed him, he would have been a bit further away still.
I don't think he deliberately covered them up. No, I don't. And even if he did, so what?
Even if he did, so what? I'm going to have to go back and rehearse the whole scenario. All the other victims, the Whitechapel murderer who had abdominal injuries, you want to go through Martha Tabram, Annie Chapman, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Kelly, were left on display. Legs akimbo, the wounds visible. It was part of the shock and awe routine of the killer. The only victim that didn't have their abdominal wounds on display was Polly Nichols. They were covered. So the question is, why were they covered? And it's almost certainly because the culprit was disturbed and didn't have time to leave them on display, or wanted to cover them, more likely to hide the fact that she had abdominal wounds, to make it less obvious, because he was in a compromising situation. And that is why it matters.
The next point, because of course, when we're told that when Cross and Paul are stooped down over the body, they're sort of trying to find out if she's still alive or not. Robert Paul suggests they sit the woman up, and Charles Cross point blank refuses. He said, he doesn't want to touch the dead body any further. So that's often used to point to a sign of his guilt, in that he doesn't want Robert Paul to sit the body up, because if he does, then the wounds are going to become apparent and obvious to Robert Paul. How much truth is there in that?
Well, I mentioned that because I used 2 different sources. I used the Telegraph and the Times, both from the 4th of September 1888. And one says that Cross suggested to prop him up and Paul wouldn't, and the other one suggests that Paul suggested the prop and Cross wouldn't. So just taking those 2 examples, and there are more, it's 50-50.
So you have to read all of the accounts to get a true sense of who touched her when. And when you look at them all, and there's not 2 accounts, there's about a dozen, it's very clear that Paul suggested propping her up and Lechmere refused. Because if he had done it, this is the aspect to it for the Lechmere theory, because if he had done it, the head would have lolled back, the wound would have become apparent, and so forth. The nature of reporting at these inquests, when you've got 10 or so or more reporters all reporting on the same thing with shorthand, writing it down very quickly about things that they're not familiar with, is that some of them make mistakes. Some garble it up. He said this, I was this person was there, it was outside the warehouse, it was outside this warehouse, I did this, the other person did that. They can make mistakes. So you have to look at all the reports to get a true sense of what actually happened when it's a slightly complicated thing. The touching and the whole touching scenario of Polly Nichols' body by Robert Paul and Lechmere, any time in any of these murders where you get this elaborate touching of the body, he touched her there, he touched her here. It's the only murder where you get this, another red flag, if you like. And it's all in Charles Lechmere's testimony. And I'm going to read this account from the East London Observer, which shows the whole context of how this scenario played out. The other man, which was Paul, placed his hand on her heart, saying, I think she's breathing, but it's very little if she is. He, Paul, suggested that they should shift her, meaning, in the witness's opinion, the witness here was Lechmere, that they should seat her upright. The witness, which is Lechmere, replied, "I'm not going to touch her." The Telegraph, which did suggest it was Lechmere that wanted to give the prop, this is how they reported it. Witness, which was Lechmere, suggested that they should give her a prop, but his companion, which was Paul, refused to touch her. Just then they heard a policeman coming. Well, you know, that policeman coming is a load of nonsense, because the Telegraph reporter got it wrong. The Star also gave quite a detailed account of this part of the testimony. The other man, which was Paul, put his hand on the breast outside her clothes over her heart and said, "I think she's breathing, but very little." He suggested they should shift her, that's Paul, set her against the wall, but witness, that's Lechmere, said, "I'm not going to touch her." So the context is, Paul touched her breast, thought he felt a movement, that she was breathing, thought that she was alive, so he wanted to prop her up. And that's why he suggested propping her up. And Lechmere said, "No, I don't want to touch her." So it's indisputable that it was Paul who wanted to prop her up and Lechmere who refused.
Even if Cross did refuse, I can't see how that's a sign of guilt. And to me, if he was guilty, he'd want to do that. He'd want to get his hands in there and get them all bloodied and have blood up to his... Because if he got stopped by the police, he could say, "Oh, well, I propped the body up and that's why I've got blood all over us."
Again, this totally fails to understand what was going on here, why he covered the wounds. He covered the wounds. He didn't want Paul to realise that she was dead. He wanted to get away from the situation without a big fuss. He wanted to get away without anyone thinking the body was dead. He didn't know how Paul would react with a blatantly dead body, did he? He wouldn't know whether they're going trying to raise the alarm with PC-81 of the Great London Eastern Railway, who was on duty just 60 yards away in his little hut. He didn't want that to happen. He wanted to get away from the situation with the least fuss possible. He didn't want to start sticking his hands in the gore, because he didn't want anyone to know. He didn't want Paul in particular to know or to think that she was dead.
I know I wouldn't want to touch a dead body, especially nowadays with all the DNA and forensics we've got. But even still, I wouldn't want to touch a dead body. And I would imagine most people would be in the same position.
I often think myself, if that was me, and if I found a dead body in the street, and obviously, well, you know, I'm not certain who that person is. You know, would I really want to be touching the dead body? No, you know, I'm a bit on the squeamish side, I'm afraid, and I think a lot of people would be in the same position.
There's two things here. Did Lechmere touch the body after thinking she was perhaps dead? Witness, that's Lechmere, took hold of the woman's hands, which were cold and limp. Witness, that's Lechmere, said, "I believe she's dead." He touched her face, which felt warm. So after saying, "I believe she's dead," he then touched her face. So he was touching her after thinking, supposedly in his testimony, that she was dead. Lechmere testified that he said to PC Misen, "She looked to me either dead or drunk." So that's a 50-50 whether she's dead or alive. It's also reported that Lechmere said at the inquest under questioning, in his opinion, deceased looked as if she had been outraged and gone off in a swoon, but he had no idea that there were any serious injuries. So that implies that he thought she had fainted after being effectively outraged. So that implies that he thought she had effectively fainted after being assaulted, and not dead, in other words, and not drunk either. This is a lengthier version of that same testimony. The coroner: "Did you see anything of a struggle?" Witness, this is Lechmere: "She seemed to me as if she had been outraged." "You did not think so at the time?" "Yes, I did, but I didn't think she'd been injured." "You had no idea that she'd been injured at all?" "No." So clearly he didn't think she had any injuries, according to this part of the testimony, although he thought in other parts of the testimony that she's drunk. That just shows that Lechmere is switching. He thinks she's dead. He thinks she's drunk. He thinks she's been outraged. She thinks she's fainted. Did he think she was dead?
The bloodstains, etc. It brings me to another point that's often raised against him, certainly in the comment section, and it's this. It's often made that Lechmere was a delivery man, a delivery driver, or a carman, or a carter, and he worked for Pickford's. Now, Pickford's, we are told in the comment section, delivered meat. He would have delivered meat, and he would therefore have bloodstained clothing. Do we know that he actually delivered meat?
We don't know that he specifically delivered meat, and that isn't actually the important point. Pickford's at Broad Street was one of the main entry points for meat from the provinces, for cat food, horse flesh, and for human consumption, beef and pig, pork, I should say, and lamb, from all over the provinces. And it was delivered from Broad Street to shops and butcher shops around London. Now, the fact of whether or not he did it himself is somewhat secondary. It just means that he wouldn't have looked out of place. People wouldn't have said, look, oh, bloody hell, that's very strange. Someone's walking around with a bit of blood on his overalls, because people there would. He would have mixed in, he wouldn't have stood out like a sore thumb. That's the significance there, not whether or not he personally delivered meat. There is one of the main experts on this whole issue of meat deliveries and the slaughter trade through Broad Street, a researcher called Gary Barnett, who's researched a lot of this about Broad Street and the meat trade. And it has to be borne in mind that Lechmere's family got heavily into the horseflesh business for cat's meat very soon after this, possibly was doing it this time as well. And one of his sons carted horseflesh for the cat's meat business. So it's not exactly a great leap of faith to think that Lechmere may have done it himself, is it? But it's not important actually whether he personally did it actually.
And it's also interesting to note that the British Railways document claims the Scotch fish and meat train didn't arrive at Broad Street till 4:15 a.m. So we can assume that Charles would have been out on his first set of delivery when the meat actually got delivered to the depot. So he would have missed that.
Well, we don't actually know when Lechmere's start time was. He said he got in at 4 o'clock on that day, on the day of Polly Nichols's murder at 4 a.m. in the morning. We don't actually know when his start time was. We just know that he said on that day he got there at 4 a.m. Whether that was his start time, whether it was his regular start time, we don't know. But if the train did get in at 4:15, that would just be about right, because when he turned up at work, he'd have to get his cart ready and then get to the place and then get it loaded. So it's probably about the right time for him to arrive at work if he was getting there to meet the fish and meat train down from Scotland. It actually tailors in very well.
The Lechmere supporters claim he killed on the way to work. So that means he would have had blood on him before he got to work, not actually having blood on him as a result of his deliveries. So again, to me, this delivering meat is a red herring.
On the occasions when he did murder on his way to work, presuming he was guilty, of course, are we going to assume that he went in with a clean apron each day? Are we going to assume that carmen washed their aprons clean and got all the grime and grub off from the previous day each day they went into work? I don't think so. So if he went in and there was a bit of blood on his apron that he could have rubbed in a bit anyway before he actually got into his clocked in, it wouldn't have stood out, because there would have been other people there with similarly grimy, blood-stained aprons, even if he didn't work on that trade himself.
When Cross and Paul left the scene of the murder, they vow they're going to tell the first policeman they meet of what they've found. They get to the Baker's Row, which is at the top. Well, it's just beyond White's Row, at the top of Buck's Row, and they find PC Misen. They tell PC Misen about it. At the inquest, Misen says that Charles Cross told him there was another policeman waiting for him in Buck's Row. Cross denied ever having said this. He said, I didn't say that because there wasn't another policeman waiting in Buck's Row. So this is obviously a 50-50. One of them is wrong about what happened in the exchange. According to those who say that he was guilty, the reason he made that was to mislead Misen. Which do you think is correct? Which of them do you think was correct in what was said at that time?
To be honest, Richard, I don't think either of them lied. I just think it was, again, going back to this Ockram Reserve, I think it was a simple misunderstanding. I think the important word is the word wanted. And we know in English, wanted doesn't necessarily mean that somebody wants you. It could be the situation wants you. The situation requires you.
So here we have an explanation which throws P.C. Misen's testimony into the dustbin. Virtually every account of P.C. Misen's testimony combines wanted with by a policeman. You are wanted in Bucks Row by a policeman. A woman is lying there. A carman who passed in company with another man informed him that he is wanted by a policeman in Bucks Row. You are wanted in Bucks Row. Witness now knew the man to be named Cross, and he was a carman. Witness asked him what was the matter, and Cross replied, "A policeman wants you. There is a woman lying there."
Cross was cross-examined, for want of a better word, by the jury, and he stated he never saw a policeman. The coroner believed him, the police believed him, and Misen, even if he could question him, didn't.
Well, Misen couldn't question him. He had no standing in the inquest to question him, so that was a strange remark to make.
I think, again, it's another example of it being blown all out of proportion. I think it was a simple misunderstanding. And again, is it a sign of guilt? I'm not sure. Even if it was true, even if he had seen a policeman there, or even if he had seen light to Misen, I'm not sure it's a sign of guilt.
The whole purpose of it, from Lechmere's point of view, would have been to give Misen the impression that he was a messenger acting on behalf of another policeman, just giving him a message for Misen to go back there. So Misen wouldn't stop him, wouldn't question him too much, wouldn't even bother taking his name and address, which clearly he didn't, and he would be able to get off scot-free and carry on his way to work without being stopped. That's clearly why, from the Lechmere Theory point of view, why Lechmere did it. It's a very important point, and if you don't get that, what can you say?
What's often claimed is that Charles Cross had no intention of coming forward, that he was just not going to come forward. It was over. So he was going to hide out in plain sight, effectively. But then Robert Paul is walking home along Bucks Row on the Friday afternoon or early Friday evening, and he encounters a journalist or a reporter from Lloyd's newspaper, and he gives him an interview, or a remarkable statement, as the newspaper term it. And that was then published on the Sunday. Now, Cross doesn't come forward to the inquest. He's the first day of the inquest is on the Saturday, the day after the murder. Cross doesn't come to the inquest, or doesn't appear at the inquest, till the Monday. And that's often used as another sign of guilt, because he didn't have any intention of coming forward, so the claim is, until Robert Paul effectively outed him when that article was published in Lloyd's newspaper on the Sunday.
Indeed, I've seen that proposed numerous occasions. Unfortunately for me, I would question, we don't know that Charles Cross read the remarkable statement. We've got no evidence that he did. The remarkable statement doesn't name him, doesn't describe him. Paul refers to him as the other man. And I really doubt Cross, again, and as I've just alluded to, with the sort of priority of feeding his family, would have wasted any money buying up all the newspapers to see if he'd been mentioned. You know, I don't think he would have done that. And I believe, is it the Attendance of Witness Act 1854, which was the framework on how people, were summoned to inquests and courts. And I'm not sure of the exact procedure, but I presume that Cross was actually summoned to court to appear. Remember, the court wasn't on the Sunday, the inquest, so he was actually there on the second day. So it's not, people, he didn't turn up till 3 days later, but it was...
Okay, the summonsing of witnesses to a coroner's court was covered by the Coroner's Act, and it wasn't necessary. It was only necessary if it was deemed appropriate, because they thought the witness might not attend otherwise. There was a common law obligation for any witness who thought they knew something to attend of their own volition, and so there was no obligation under the Coroner's Act for a summons to be issued. It's as simple as that. We know from an interview that Inspector Helson gave on the night before, on the Sunday night before Lechmere appeared on the Monday morning, that they still believed PC Neal was the first finder. So when Helson gave this interview on the Sunday evening, they were unaware of Lechmere and his story, because they were still categorically stating and denying that anyone else other than PC Neal had found the body. That's why we know that Lechmere hadn't come forward within those first 3 days. It's in black and white. Lloyd's Weekly newspaper that covered the story on the Sunday, Robert Paul's interview, was the biggest selling newspaper in the country. Now, if Lechmere was an innocent man, I don't believe he probably would have been reading all the newspapers. But it's a big coincidence that the biggest circulation newspaper mentioned Lechmere as being there. He was the man. Whether he could, it didn't mention him by name because they didn't know his name, didn't give a description of him, but clearly Robert Paul would recognise him, or Lechmere should have been worried or believe that Paul would recognise him, would probably likewise believe that Misen would recognise him. So he was under threat because of being recognised, not because of his name or description. The descriptions only have any use for people who weren't there, who might read the newspaper. The people who he interacted with, Misen and Paul, would reckon, or he should be worried that they would recognise him. That is why he would have come forward. But if he was innocent, I don't think he probably would have read the newspapers. If he was guilty people who were involved in a murder like that would have read the newspapers to see what was being said about his work, about his handiwork, about whether this other guy who he met, Paul, mentioned him. He would have been very interested in reading the newspapers. And I said it was the biggest circulation newspaper, so if there's any newspaper he would have read, odds are it was Lloyd's Weekly News. We've got no proof that he read Lloyd's Weekly News, obviously, but it's not exactly a huge leap of faith to suggest he would have done. Would Lechmere have come forward had Paul not blabbed to the newspapers? We don't know. We don't know that. It's impossible to know. But it's a bit of a coincidence that he certainly came forward after Helson's interview on the evening of the Sunday. That newspaper came out in the Sunday daytime. Next morning, Lechmere appears. The whole narrative changes. No longer PC Neal discovered the body. Now it's Lechmere. So are the events connected? There's certainly, the timeline fits. I'd suggest that's exactly what happened.
And I know a couple of commentators that are pro Lechmere actually go one step further and say, as revenge for outing him in the newspaper, he actually dumped the second body in Hanbury Street, which of course was close to Robert Paul's place of work.
Well, the strange thing is that this same guy thought that the police would take extra interest in Lechmere because of the Hanbury Street murder, but I would say he did it to deflect police onto Paul, who was raided by the police around that time. We don't know the exact date. I won't go into that now, but we don't know the exact date Paul was raided and dragged out of his bed at night. Clearly, because the police did have him under some sort of suspicion.
So many suspects, people plough through records now. People plough through old newspaper accounts, and I think it's the same with the shawl. It's the same with that people come at a suspect to prove that suspect guilty. So basically, they've got their mind made up. It is actually prejudice against that suspect, and of course that's something that must not be done in a court of law. That's why today, for example, whenever there's a court case, so someone's charged of murder, and especially if it's a high-profile crime, the newspapers can't really name them. They can't go into a lot of detail over them because it might prejudice the case against that person.
This is similar to the other point where the Lechmere theory is being judged more stridently and more strictly than other theories, saying, "Oh, you shouldn't come at this suspect and try and prove it was him." That's what all suspect theorists do for every suspect. It's no different from Lechmere. I guess the reason why Richard Jones does so many programmes criticising the Lechmere theory is that because it's the strongest theory, and he feels compelled to do that. But really, that's as I said earlier, it's a backhanded compliment. And the other suspect theories collapse under the slightest prodding. But this one, what we see in this programme, really has been fairly weak. I've bought the receipts and shown that virtually everything they've said is just not the case. Well, there you have it. In my obviously heavily biased opinion, the criticisms of the Lechmere theory in this podcast are without exception, without merit. In the description to this podcast, it's claimed that it skillfully dissects the case against Lechmere and lays to rest many of the inaccuracies and untruths that have been used to build the case against him. Well, I'd like to know what inaccuracies and untruths, because I've just pointed out a whole host of them that were used against the Lechmere theory in this podcast. If it was intended to kick the Lechmere theory into touch, this podcast has been an epic fail, a nothing burger. I can think of some valid objections against the Lechmere theory, which I think I'll do a film about at some point in the future. But if you can think of any, please let me know in the comments below. Also, I said at the beginning that some very important parts of the Lechmere theory were completely omitted from this podcast. So if you noticed any, again, let me know in the comments below. I fully appreciate that most of the films that I produce on the House of Lechmere presuppose that people have got quite a lot of knowledge about the Jack the Ripper murders already. But I do like to think that newcomers, people new to it, will also find a lot of benefit and enjoy the films. But I do know that they're quite demanding, because I get into the real detail, which you don't really find in other films about Jack the Ripper. Thank you for watching. Do you like this sort of reaction film? As always, please subscribe for free, share, like, and of course, comment below.